didn't correct you last week, but I'm realizing that I should let you know that the name of our shul here in Elkins Park is Adat Yeshurun, not Adat Yerushalayim, although I really like Adat Yerushalayim. It's a great name. It just doesn't happen to be the name of our shul.
Thank you. I will correct that.
Okay, thank you. All right, nice to see you, everybody. I want to honor a question that I was left with last week about the relationship between what Maimonides had to say and evolution, Darwinism, because we were talking about the form of man. So I'm not sure who asked the question, but it was a setup. It was a setup for me, because the person who has misread what the form of man means from the Guide of the Perplexed, Book 1, Chapter 7, is a very famous Jewish scientist, writer, named Aviezer Schroeder. Is his first name Aviezer? Yeah, Avi Schroeder, who I actually just saw in Jerusalem last month. For a long time, if you went to the Amazon section on science and religion, Genesis and the Big Bang, Schroeder's book, was the #1 book in science and religion. He read RaMBaM as a scientist. He's got 2 PhDs, right? The guy's a mensch. He knows a lot about science, doesn't know quite as much about Jewish thought. When Maimonides uses the expression, the form of human beings, it's form in distinction from manner. It's Aristotelian form. It's got nothing to do with physicality. It is a better translation would be the function of man. So the form of man, to use Aristotelian language, or the function of man, to use more, I think, contemporary language, for Aristotle and Maimonides, is the intellect. We are walking embodied intellects, and our goal in life, for Aristotle and for RaMBaM, is to perfect our intellects to the degree that is possible. Schroeder read the guide, where Maimonides talks about people who are who are humanoid, but don't have the form of men. He's not talking about like some kind of gorilla or some kind of evolutionary stage before Homo sapiens. He's talking about people who are not using their intellect to their full capacity. And so, although it's easy to get confused with this language of form and matter being transported from Greek philosophy to contemporary American language, that's not what Maimonides meant. And those people who mistake the idea of form for a physical form simply don't understand what Maimonides was talking about when he was channeling the Aristotelian language of medieval Arabic culture. It occurred to me also to say that the kind of Arabic culture where people are writing poems on napkins, it's kind of like one of those opening scenes in Hamilton, where everybody is speaking in kind of rap rhyme. And when Aaron Burr comes in, they say, drop me a verse. And that kind of banter in poetic form that we saw in Hamilton seems to be similar to what we have a sense of in medieval Arabic culture as well, regardless of religion. All right, so today we are going to be looking at Maimonides, not in his father, but Maimonides and his brother David. And the subject of today's session is going to be grief, suffering, and grief, evil, and providence. Okay, so here we go. All right. So just as last week, we stopped at 2 different places, we're going to stop at 2 different places today. So David was Maimonides' little brother, was Musa's little brother, David. He died. We'll talk about how he died in a couple of slides. But this is RaMBaM's description of his own grief years after his kid brother died. I was at death's door. Years have waned, but I still mourn and find no solace. And what could bring me solace anyway? He grew up on my lap. He was my brother and pupil. My only joy was to see him. All my joy is gone. He has passed on to eternal life, leaving me shattered in a strange land. And this line, for somebody who has lost a parent or a sibling or a spouse, was particularly poignant for me. Whenever I see his handwriting or one of his books, my heart turns over within me and my grief comes awake again. I remember when it came time to clean out my dad's desk, and he had his, we used to have these things called phone books, like personal phone books where you would put people's names in, and then when they would move addresses or change phone numbers, you would have to like scratch it out. So he had one of those, and I couldn't get myself to throw that away. Okay, I wanted to show you this because you really get a sense of who RaMBaM the man is and how what he says in his code might be great advice, but as we'll see, even the person who offers great advice can't always take his own great advice. In the Laws of Mourning, RaMBaM comes out and says one shouldn't cry over the deceased for more than 3 days, and you shouldn't eulogize him for more than 7. And even if he's a great scholar, there's a limit. There's a limit. But as you can see, RaMBaM in his letter to a friend talks about the years having gone by, but he's still mourning and finding no solace. So there's a dispute in Greek philosophy about whether or not if you know the truth, it means that you also have to do the truth. If you know that smoking cigarettes is lethal eventually, right? Does it mean that you know it to the point where you act on it, or it's just intellectual knowledge? So for Maimonides, it's just intellectual knowledge. He goes on in the Laws of Mourning to say a person should not become excessively brokenhearted because of anybody's death, because death is the nature of the world. It's the pattern of the world. And anybody who causes himself grief because of the pattern of the world is a fool, right? And he's writing this years and years after David's death. So he's calling himself a fool, but what can you do, right? Pascal says the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. So I wanted to give you this sense of Maimonides doesn't talk about anybody else this way. He doesn't talk about his wife this way. He doesn't talk about his kids this way, or his parents, but he did talk about his brother this way. Part of the reason, perhaps, that he felt so attached to his brother was because his brother was supporting him. And when David died, Maimonides had to go to work as a doctor. So the reason why RaMBaM needed support is because he was engaged in Torah study, in being the leader of the Jewish community in terms both of teaching and of judging. And it was unimaginable for Maimonides to receive payment for engaging in a Torah activity, for engaging in judging, for engaging in teaching. I would be an embarrassment to Maimonides for a number of reasons, including the fact that I'm a paid rabbi. And so for the tradition, being paid for a mitzvah is pasnisht, right? It's unseemly. It just should not be done. But so that's why RaMBaM was being supported by his brother David. So this is what RaMBaM says. Anyone who thinks that he should involve himself in Torah study without doing any work, like some people today, and derive his livelihood from tzedakah, desecrates God's name, dishonors the Torah, extinguishes the light of faith, brings evil upon himself. Like, let's just add a few more, just in case we haven't gotten the point. Forfeits the life in Olam Haba. And it's forbidden to, right? Therefore, it's forbidden to derive benefit from the words of Torah in this world. And he goes on to say, all Torah that is not accompanied by work will eventually be negated and lead to sin. So I throw this in because it's relevant not only to our story, but to the contemporary Jewish world as well. Okay. So RaMBaM is experiencing grief. So the question is that grief, is that suffering, is that evil that he is experiencing as a result of his brother's death, is that a punishment from God? Is that an act of individual providence, of hashgacha pratit, that God has seen something that Maimonides has done wrong, or Maimonides or God has seen something that David, the son of Maimon, has done wrong and punished David by killing him? So those are now the issues that we're going to raise about the experience, not about what actually happened, but about the experience of what happened. So any questions at this point about mourning? I didn't think there would be any questions so early, but if there are any questions, no. Okay. So we are now in the Guide of the Perplexed, 1180. The Guide of the Perplexed is composed of 3 books, and his discussion of evil and providence is in the last book, so after he's gotten a running start. So this I'm going to read. This is a little more difficult. It's philosophy. It's a little more difficult to understand. But in other ways, it's more funny. It's more humorous. Men frequently think that the evils in this world are more numerous than the good things. Not only common people make this mistake, but even many who believe that they are wise. They're not wise. They just believe they're wise. The origin of this error is to be found in the circumstances that these ignorant men believe that the whole universe exists only for them, as if nothing else required any consideration. So if, therefore, anything happens to him contrary to his expectation, he at once concludes that the whole universe is evil. If, however, he would take into consideration the whole universe, form an idea of it, and comprehend what a small portion he is of the universe, he will find the truth. So at this time, in the Middle Ages, in Arabic culture, there were those who were considered to be philosophers who thought that there's more evil in the world than good. And so Maimonides isn't saying, as Leibniz will later, that this is the best of all possible worlds, right? Maimonides doesn't say that. But he also says the only reason why somebody would think there's more evil in this world than good is because they are so egocentric. They are so consumed by what's happening to them that they're not looking out beyond themselves and be able to see the goodness in the world. Okay, Andy, I'm just going to let you know that I see you, and when I stop for the next set of questions, you will be the first person to ask. Okay. The numerous evils to which individual persons are exposed are due to the defects existing in the persons themselves. Okay, so we're going to have a chance to explain this a little more, but what Maimonides begins by saying is whatever evil people experience, it doesn't have to do with God punishing them. It has to do with them themselves, maybe them themselves individually, or maybe humans against other humans, right? We'll see where this goes. The evils that befall men are of 3 kinds. The first kind of evil is that which is caused to human beings as a result of being physical, of being subject to generation and destruction, meaning being born and dying, or that he possesses a body. That's the first category of evil, is that not only do we get brain cancer, God forbid, but we also are subject to being burned alive by fires. If we didn't have a body, then we wouldn't be subject to being burned alive by fires. If we didn't have a body, we wouldn't be vulnerable to cancers. But what he says is that we have to have bodies because that's the only way that we can die. The only thing that doesn't have a body and that's eternal is God. So he goes on to say, this evil may be part of the natural constitution, or may have developed subsequently in consequence of changes in the elements. So what's he talking about? Maybe a place has increased smog. And so the lungs that were serving you very well when there wasn't any smog are no longer serving you well, either because there's smog or because you have relocated next to a coal plant that doesn't have proper scrubbers, and so you are being polluted. Or thunderstorms or landslides. In other words, thunderstorms with the lightning coming down and setting things on fire, or landslides, those are evil, but they're only evil from our point of view because we receive the consequences of those evils. Now, what RaMBaM says at the very bottom, also in red, the evils of the above kind which befall human beings are very few and rare. They're probably becoming more frequent, and for sure we know more about them because of the news. But the idea that human beings suffer as a result of our physical body, he says, is rare, and there are very few. For you find countries that have not been flooded or burned for thousands of years, thousands of people in perfect health, deformed individuals are a strange and exceptional occurrence. Or say few in number if you object to the term exceptional. They are not 100th, not even 1,000th part of those who are perfectly normal. So what he's trying to do is to put things in perspective, to pull back the camera from the individual who is so absorbed by his or her own sufferings, by his or her own conditions, and to say, look, right, in general, things are really, really good, and there are isolated incidents of what we're going to call evil, but it's only evil because we have bodies. Okay. Now, on the one hand, right, we have bodies. What, God couldn't have made us without bodies? No, God couldn't have, because then we would be eternal. If we didn't come into being with a form, we wouldn't go out of being, so we wouldn't die. And that is against all of the Aristotelian precepts of logic that he has introduced earlier. All right, so that's number one. Let's go for number two. The second class of evils are those that people cause to one another. These evils are more numerous than those of the first kind. Their causes are numerous and known. They likewise originate in ourselves, though the sufferer himself cannot avert them. So people have ills themselves. What he means by that is we're not thinking with intellectual perfection. This is the Wannsee conference down here, by the way, in the lower right-hand corner. And as a result of not thinking clearly, of not thinking intellectually, not thinking rationally, we engage in harmful activity to others and cause other people to suffer. Right? This kind of evil is nevertheless not widespread in any country of the whole world. It's relatively rare that a man plans to kill his neighbor or to rob him of his property by night. Many people are, however, afflicted with this kind of evil when there are wars. But wars are not frequent if the whole inhabited part of the earth is taken into account. So the first category of evil is as a result of having a physical body. The second category of evil is the evil that humans inflict on other humans. And here's the third category. The third class of evil comprises those which everyone causes to himself by his own action, self-inflicted wounds. This is the largest class and is far more numerous than the second class. It is especially of these evils that all men complain. Only few men are found that do not sin against themselves by this kind of evil. All right, now he's going to go on to talk about the nature of self-inflicted wounds. So he's breaking this down into two kinds of causes, but it's still this third class of evils, the self-inflicted wounds. Such evils of the soul, of the mind, are the necessary consequences of the changes in. Okay, let's not worry about that. Let's talk about this. The soul, when accustomed to luxuries, when accustomed to superfluous things, the soul or the mind, for Maimonides, it's the same thing, right? The intellectual soul acquires a strong habit of desiring things which are neither necessary for the preservation of the individual nor for that of the species. This desire, we would call it greed, is limitless. While things that are necessary for humans to survive are few in number and abundant. But what is superfluous is without end. That is, you desire to have your vessels of silver, but golden vessels are even better. Others have even vessels of sapphire, or maybe they can be made of emerald or rubies, or any other substance that could be suggested. Those who are ignorant and perverse in their thoughts are constantly in trouble and pain. They're constantly wanting things that they don't need because they can't get as much of superfluous things as a certain other person possesses. This is in bold, and this is where we're going to stop for a second. They, as a rule, expose themselves to great dangers. That is, by sea voyage or service of kings, and all this for the purpose of obtaining that which is superfluous and not necessary. Maimonides' brother, David, who died, traded in gems, and his ship sunk in the Indian Ocean in 1171. This is a reflex of a guilty conscience. This tells you that it was, in retrospect, completely unnecessary and superfluous for David to be engaging in such risky behavior as traveling on the open seas in order to do the kind of business that was required, since David had many children himself and was also supporting his brother Musa, his brother Moshe. We see here that Maimonides is berating himself for being part of the burden that his brother was shouldering. For the more we desire to have that which is superfluous, the more we meet with difficulties. Our strength and our possessions are spent in unnecessary things, and our strength and our possessions are wanting when required for that which is necessary. No intelligent person, I think, considers musk, amber, rubies, and emeralds as very necessary for human beings. All right, at this point, I'm going to stop the share and we're going to take some questions. Andy, true to my word, you have the first question. Barbara Skolnick, you have the next question.
Okay, wait. Here I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, Andy, I can hear you.
Okay, so I put in the chat a comment, but I'll just repeat it. When you said that my mom suffered for such a long time because he had financial arrangements with his brother, I found that abhorrent. And now you mentioned that I'm thinking he had guilt, and that's why he had so much grief, and the guilt was because of financial. But unless you have a little bit more information on their personal relationship, it sounds terrible to stick that label on him, that his grief was based on finances. And that's it.
So there was a whole section at the beginning that I didn't hear. So I'm not sure if you're saying, I'm not sure what your question is. I don't really have any more information about their relationship. So
my question is, why would you, to me sounds like, why would you jump to that conclusion that Maimonides' grief was a financial issue rather than the grief of an older brother who,
the grief of a younger brother. Yeah. So
well, it's the older brother's grief.
Okay, Andy, I think I have the question. I think I understand it now. Thank you. So
okay,
I don't think that the financial relationship is what caused the grief. I think the grief was absolutely natural for the loss of a kid brother who was the love of his life. It was his only, the only other family member that he had. He didn't have any sisters. He had one little brother. But I do think that the financial relationship between the two of them exacerbated a sense of guilt. So that is, that's my own sense of things.
So,
okay, Barbara.
Rav Shai, just in favor of time, I think if people just throw their questions into the chat, and I can, because we already have questions before these raised hands. So I'm gonna.
Okay.
Okay, so if people can drop them in the chat, I'll make sure we ask them. And while I see Marcia and Esther and Mark, while you're tapping them into the chat, I'll ask the previous questions that were asked, okay? So we have here a question: in the second class of evil, what we do to each other, is it done individually? Is it, say, racism, or collectively, like systemic? This is a major difference in the current understanding of how racism or anti-Semitism is caused. So if you can relate to that.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think Maimonides really is talking about both at the individual level and at the collective level. And at some point at the collective level, it becomes war.
Okay. We have here another question. What would he have said about the holistic? I don't know if this is the full question or half of it.
The holistic?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. The Holocaust? Oh, the Holocaust.
Oh, maybe there was a typo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So he would say that this is a perfect example, perfect meaning an excellent example of problem number 2, where you've got ignorant people like the Nazis who somehow think that the Jews are the enemy, who think that the Jews are cancerous and need to be removed, and so go to war against that population. For just about any problem you can imagine, Maimonides' answer is education. So for those of us who feel the same way, like, you're just ignorant, you just don't understand, you know, you just need to exercise your intellect a little more. You're getting bad information, right? That approach is a very Maimonidean approach.
I'm looking, I'm waiting. I have Mark and Esther. I can see your hands are up, but I can't see your question. So I'm going to go back for a moment. There was a question about mourning. That the Torah, doesn't the Torah say 30 days of mourning as took place for Moses and Aaron? And how would RaMBaM relate to that?
Yeah, so RaMBaM says explicitly that it doesn't matter how big of a gadol, how big of a Torah giant you are, or how big of a community leader you are. Moshe was only mourned for 30 days. Nobody's better than Moshe, so 30 days is absolutely the longest you can mourn for anybody.
Okay, so let me just see one moment. Okay, there's a comment here by Esther. Evil requires a physical body. God has no body, so explain an aspect of God, Satan. That's quite a...
Explain an aspect of God's...
Of God, comma, Satan. I'm not sure, Esther, what you meant by this comment or if it's a question. Yeah, I think, okay.
I don't understand it either.
Me neither. Okay, I think that's it for now in terms of the questions I received here.
Okay, Marcia Kaplan, can you just quickly give us your question and I'll see if I can answer it quickly.
Okay, Marcia, one moment, I'll find her to unmute.
She's got to unmute. Okay.
I'm gonna unmute you. You're unmuted now, Marcia.
In all of the conversation about how Moshe might have felt guilty about David's drowning at sea, as part of a class on the Geniza fragments, there is in there a part of the letter David wrote assuring his brother not to worry. I was saved by God in the desert. I will be just fine. Take care of the kids and yada yada. So I don't know how much, I mean, he was grief-stricken, yes, but I don't know if it was related to the fact that he lost his source of income.
I never meant to suggest that it was because he lost his source of income that he was experiencing grief. I only meant to say that his grief was exacerbated by the fact that his brother was going on these long trips, long dangerous trips.
Yes, and they both knew that, and they both knew that. Yeah.
Right, in part to support Maimonides.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. All right, let's continue. So now we're going to talk about Providence.
Rav Shai, one more question that I just received. Does the RaMBaM mean that formal mourning has certain time limits?
Absolutely. Yeah, formal mourning has certain time limits. You can't control what you can't control. But in terms of formal mourning, you know, you've got Shiva, you've got Shloshim, you've got the yard site, and that's it. He's very strict about formal mourning practices. Okay. All right, so this last section, I think, is the most difficult to understand because he is not clear, as well as the most radical. So let me say a word about those aspects of the Guide of the Perplexed that are not clear. In his introduction to the guide, he says that when he gets to certain parts, when he gets to certain topics, he is going to lie. He tells you ahead of time that he's going to lie. He tells you ahead of time that he's going to plant different seeds in different chapters that are not sequential, and that the intelligent person who knows what he's getting at is going to need to put these different ideas together. That has been a recipe for a whole industry of Maimonidean scholars who believe that Maimonides meant different things. So this is one of those topics about which different Maimonidean scholars believe different things. Another piece or another aspect of Maimonides' thought is whether or not Maimonides thought that God created the world after there was absolutely nothing, or whether Maimonides thought, along with Aristotle, that the world is eternal, that it's always been the way it is now and always will be the way it is now. So it is very, very rare for Maimonides to disagree with Aristotle. So there is evidence to suggest that Maimonides agreed with Aristotle about the creation of the earth. Similarly, there is evidence to suggest that Maimonides disagreed with Aristotle about the creation of the earth. We're talking now about providence. So I think there's less room for that disagreement, but I want to present to you what Maimonides says. Okay. I do not believe that it is through the interference of divine providence that a certain leaf drops from a tree. Nor do I hold that when a certain spider catches a certain fly, that this is the direct result of a special decree and will of God in that moment. It's not by a particular divine decree that the spit of somebody moved and fell on a gnat and killed it, right? He's making fun of people who say that. So when people say everything happens for a reason, if they mean that everything has a cause, that's obvious. Everything has a cause and effect. If what they mean is that everything happens as a result of some predestined plan or design that God has, and God is unfolding that plan, Maimonides disagrees with that idea. Okay? In all these cases, the action is entirely due to chance, just as taught by Aristotle. Okay. So first we get that out of the way. Next, divine providence does exist, and it's connected with divine intellectual influence. And the same beings which are benefited by that divine influence, so that they are intellectual and to comprehend things that are comprehensible for rational beings, are also under the control of divine providence, which examines all their deeds in order to reward or punish them. So we've now introduced, Maimonides has introduced the language of reward and punishment, but only for those people who are understanding things rationally. Okay. It may be by mere chance that a ship goes down with all her contents, or the roof of a house falls upon those who are within the house. But it's not due to chance, according to our view, that in the one instance the men went onto the ship, or that the people remained in the house in the other instance. It's due to the will of God, and is in accordance with the justice of his judgments, the method of which our mind is incapable of understanding. In other words, the ship going down because of a storm, that may have been just coincidence, but David didn't have to get on that ship, right? He put himself in danger. Providence watches over every rational being according, and only according, to the amount of intellect which that being has. Those who are perfect in their perception of God, which is nobody, whose mind is never separated from God, which is nobody, they enjoy always the influence of providence. But those who, even when they're perfect in their knowledge of God, sometimes turn their mind away from God, enjoy the presence of divine providence only when they are meditating on God. But when their thoughts are engaged in other matters, when they're distracted from thinking about God, divine providence departs from them. So even those people who are intellectually perfect, which is nobody, but assuming for the sake of argument that you have someone who is intellectually perfect, they are only protected by divine providence when they are engaged in thinking about God. When they are distracted, they are exposed. The force field comes down, right? They are vulnerable. Hence, it appears to me that it's only in times of such neglect, some kind of distraction, that some of the ordinary evils happen to a prophet or a perfect and pious man. And the intensity of the evil is proportional to the duration of those moments, as long as it lasts, or to the character of the things that thus occupy their mind. Like, I was completely checked out. I had no idea what was going on around me. Providence does not extend to every individual. And that person is like any other living being in this respect. That is the argument based on the fact that good and pious men are afflicted with great evils. We've explained this difficult question, even according to Maimonides, to Aristotle's own principles. Divine providence is constantly watching over those who have obtained that blessing, which is prepared for those who endeavor to obtain it. Okay, and here's a key sentence. If a person frees his thoughts from worldly matters and obtains a knowledge of God in the right way, and rejoices in that knowledge, it is impossible that any kind of evil should befall him while he is with God and God with him. In your chats, tell me why I have put rejoice in red. Moving right along. It's now clearly established, QED, quite easily done, that the cause of our being exposed to chance and abandoned to destruction, like cattle, is to be found in our separation from God. Those who have their God dwelling in their hearts are not touched by any evil whatever, for God says, fear thou not, for I am with thee, be not dismayed, for I am thy God. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. For if we prepare ourselves and attain the influence of the divine intellect, providence is joined to us, and we are guarded against all evils. Okay, I'm going to stop and take some questions at this point before we get to the punchline.
Perfect. And I will say that in the meantime, you can see what people are writing about the rejoice. Can you see it, Rav Shai? Can you see it in the chat?
So B, let's see, who's B?
Okay, I will quote some of the things in the chat, but I'll start with a few questions that came up in this part. First one, Rina asking, is RaMBaM against the idea of anything that being predetermined? Or
yes, he is.
Okay, another question that came in, which takes us a little further back, but I think is worthwhile asking: who are the perplexed? To whom is this is the philosophy addressed?
Good. So in his, it's called an epistolary dedication. So epistolary just means letter, right? So he's writing this as a letter to a student of his that he had begun learning with, but then the student had to move. So the Guide of the Perplexed is written to follow up on the lessons that the student of RaMBaM's never got to hear because the student had to move away prematurely. And he says in the beginning, this is philosophy. This is not meant for the average person. This is meant for the 1 in 10,000. Right? For the very intellectual elite. And what are they perplexed? Like, if you don't think about something, you're not perplexed about it, right? Being in a state of perplexion. How's my perplexion? Being in a state of perplexion only exists because you're thinking about it. And what are you thinking about? You're thinking about what the plain surface text of the Torah and the rabbinic tradition says that is in conflict with what Aristotle has demonstrated to be the case about reality. So I'm perplexed. We have a tradition that says God said X, Y, and Z, and we have a demonstration that Aristotle has proven negative X, negative Y, and negative Z. What do I believe? So the perplexed are those people who are in that state of what do I believe when the tradition that has come down from my parents and their parents tells me one thing, but Aristotle has demonstrated something else to be the case. Okay.
Okay, another question. Does the sense of truly being in touch with God, protecting from evil, mean evil in the world on balance? As you mentioned before, really that person will not suffer from evil. Another question about the individual and collective, but this time in terms of the evil.
Sherelle, can you repeat that more slowly, please?
Yes, sorry. I'll just read it out.
Yeah.
Does the sense of truly being in touch with God, protecting from evil, mean evil in the world on balance, as you mentioned before, or really that that person will not suffer from evil?
Neither. So that's easy. Neither.
Can you
Okay,
explain
next
that a little bit?
question.
Next question. Okay. One moment. Da, 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 da. Was there a pivotal moment that brought RaMBaM some sort of peace with his brother's death? If there's any story on that, or
I don't know.
that.
I don't know. We'll talk more about RaMBaM and his son in the last session, but I don't know of any nice Hollywood ending to resolve the grief that he felt vis-a-vis his brother.
Okay. If study of Torah is exclusively without work is considered a negative, then those who work are eternally distracted from Providence?
No, not at all. The trick is to only work as much as you need to work, right? So that when you're not working, just because you have to work doesn't mean you have to work all day, every day. You don't have to be a workaholic, right? Shabbos, right? You got to take time off. And so it's during those times when you're not working that you should be engaged in Talmud Torah. And part of what Talmud Torah, the highest level of Talmud Torah for RaMBaM is Aristotelian philosophy and science. Okay.
There's a question there. If there is an example of a person who wouldn't be affected by evil, is there, even if that theory that he's placing has some kind of example?
Okay, we'll get there.
Okay. And you asked about rejoice, why it's red, and there are a few comments here. Engagement in thought of God will be rejoicing. That's what Judith wrote. We have from Catherine, rejoice implies consciousness to me, awareness, mindfulness. What else do we have about rejoice? One moment. Rejoice infers or is redemption. And that's by James Salander. And Joe wrote, rejoice is mystical engagement with Providence. So those are just a few.
Okay, great. So let us take a look at what I think is going on here. And it's not just me, it's Samuel Ibn Tibbon. So Samuel Ibn Tibbon was born in the same place that RaMBaM was born, in Cordoba. And he was the one who translated the guide from Arabic because you couldn't write, you couldn't. Hebrew didn't have the kind of philosophical, technical language that Arabic had. So when RaMBaM went to write a philosophical treatise, he wrote it in Hebrew letters, but in the Arabic language. And it wasn't until 1204 that anybody, and in this case it was Shmuel ibn Tibbon, translated it into Hebrew and came up with all kinds of neologisms, all kinds of new words like ruchaniyut. What's ruach? Spirit. Ruchaniyut, it was a word that now means spirituality, but there wasn't a word for spirituality up until Shmuel ibn Tibbon coined it. Shmuel ibn Tibbon had some questions that he wanted to ask RaMBaM about the translation. So he writes him a letter. We have the letter that RaMBaM wrote back to Shmuel ibn Tibbon saying, like outlining the schedule of his day, saying, I'm sorry, I'm just so busy with davening and with seeing all the patients in the clinic and with taking care of the royal court in Cairo. I just don't have any time to see you. As it is, I'm only sleeping 4 hours a day. Some people think that was a way to say, I don't want to validate any of your interpretations because you're on the right track. And what we know Samuel ibn Tibbon understood was that events happen to people in the same way. But intellectually perfected people don't experience those things, anything, as evil. It's just the way of the world. Some people get cancer, some people drown, some people fill in the blank. And there's right, what RaMBaM said in the Mishneh Torah, anybody who grieves themselves about the way of the world is a fool, is a fool. A fool is the opposite of being intellectually perfect. So once you understand that it's the way of the world, it's not going to cause you any grief. It's not going to bring you any suffering. So what RaMBaM is describing is a change in human perception about those things that happen by chance, right? As Aristotle understands it. Let me say that again. When RaMBaM talks about the providence for the intellectually perfect people, when they are engaged in intellecting, which is a verb for Maimonides, he's talking about the kind of psychological, perceptional shift that happens as a result of understanding the nature of reality. And so when you understand the nature of reality, you are not grieving, you're not suffering, you are not lamenting the fact that you got this terrible disease, or that your dad or your mom or your partner got this terrible disease. You understand that it was just chance. It's not a punishment. Maimonides says that and this he's explicit about. There's no controversy about this. Maimonides says that the description of the rewards and the punishments in the Torah are meant for pedagogic purposes, in order to keep people in line, in order to provide a disincentive for bad behavior, but they are not true. He uses the Platonic language of a noble lie. Maimonides says that when the Torah talks about reward and punishment, it is a lie. That he's explicit about. So clearly, he means, and this is also uncontroversial, that God doesn't reward and punish people according to their behavior. But if you do something stupid and something bad happens as a result of it, right, that's kind of a natural consequence. And so Maimonides is taking this traditional notion of hashgacha, of providence, and he wants to talk about reward and punishment for those 9,999 people that need the idea of reward and punishment in order to modulate their behavior. But he also wants to provide enough information for those who understand Aristotelian philosophy that it's a noble lie, that what hashgacha isn't about something from the outside that God manipulates in our world. It's about something inside our own minds that understands what happens to us in a naturalistic manner. That's pretty radical, isn't it? You know, you kind of think of what Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, I mean, he's from. How can somebody who's from not believe in individual providence? That's part of the reason I'm teaching the class, because we have this from pious, very conservative, by the way, halachically, very conservative, not a proto-feminist in any way, but nevertheless, he has accepted what he seems to agree that Aristotle has proven about the nature of reality. Okay, Sherelle, pepper me with questions.
So there are a few questions here that actually relate directly to what you said about him being radical. Was if he was considered heretic, was he threatened with excommunication? How were his writings received at the time?
So at the time, right, the guy wrote the Mishneh Torah. He is a halachist. He also does this philosophy thing. He was widely respected, even if people didn't agree that there should be such a thing as a code. There was opposition to the writing of a legal code, but it didn't have to do with his philosophical thought. That did happen in northern Spain and southern France in the 1220s and 1230s, but he was long dead after there was any major controversy about his philosophical radicalness.
Okay, and I'm going back to one question relating evil that I now understand, asked by Stephen from Toronto. Is Satan an aspect of God since it's evil with no body? That's going back to the body and eternal.
Yeah, so Maimonides says, he's quoting a rabbinic comment, that Satan is the Yetzer Hara. Right? The Yetzer Hara is the internal voice that wants you to indulge your appetites right now without concern for consequences. Right? Yetzer Hara is sometimes translated as the evil drive or the evil impulse, but it's the idea of indulging your appetites right now without any consideration for future consequences. And there is no Satan out there, just like there is no individual providence out there, right? It's all how you understand your own motivations and the nature of cause and effect.
Okay. I'm just checking. I think we have time for one last question. Okay, Maimonides said, God has no body. Today we could say God's body is the universe. That is pantheism. So if you can relate to that.
Maimonides would still say that pantheists are wrong, wrong, wrong. The form of the universe is divine, but not the matter.
Okay, and Rina Panush has her hand up for very long. So Rina, next time we do it in chat, but we're going to close the session with this exception for you to ask a question.
Thanks. I can't do it in chat. I don't have everyone, and I haven't had it for 9 months. I can only chat.
Rina, what's your question?
Here's the question. I want to know if it's backwards. Can you reverse it? In other words, if you are not constantly engaged with providence, then you will be punished. In other words, when you take a break and you're distracted, it gets you in trouble. On the other hand, you said
it gets you in trouble, but the word punishment, Rina, suggests that someone is punishing you. You're punishing yourself by crossing the street without looking both ways.
Yeah, that's the stupid thing. If you do a stupid thing, you'll get a result.
Yeah.
But what's that other thing near the beginning when I first put my hand up, when you said that if someone is distracted from studying Torah, then something bad will happen to them. Is that true?
Okay, so it's not that they're distracted from studying Torah, it's they're distracted from thinking about God's reality in Maimonides, right? It's not lighting Shabbos candles. That's not what RaMBaM is talking about. RaMBaM is talking about intellecting about the divine presence, intellecting about God. Okay, so if you are taking a break from that, Maimonides says that you are now vulnerable, you are now exposed, and the degree to which you have taken a mental furlough and the length of time that you have taken a mental furlough is proportionate to the amount of exposure you now have to something that is untoward.
Okay, so he's equilibrating, he's equalizing, paying attention to life, being alive, and paying attention to everything. He's equating that to meditating on God. So you should be intellectually aware all the time, and then nothing bad will happen to you.
Right, and since we know, because he says other places, that no one is intellectually perfect, and no one can maintain that level of consciousness all the time, right? So he's using these as examples, but they're straw men, they're counterexamples, because he wants the people to understand, he wants the 1 in 10,000 to understand that divine providence for the individual is not a reality, that it really doesn't exist. And that if someone happens to be at that level, at that moment, they won't experience whatever is happening to them as evil, because they, by definition, will have attained an intellectual perfection and perception that what's happening to them is just the nature of reality. It ain't nothing personal. Okay.
Thank you. That's a beautiful sentence to end with. I do just want to say, first of all, I will correct the shul Adat Yeshurun, and I'll say it loudly since Adat Yeshurun are also great supporters of CSP. So sorry for butchering the name. And thank you for supporting CSP. I will also say that today I didn't start with explaining how the chat will work and the questions. So next week I'll do it so it will be a little clearer. And I apologize to all those that found it a little confusing of how to ask your questions. So we'll set the ground, kind of those things next session in a more clear way to start with. Thank you, Rav Shai, for an amazing journey session, 1 hour ride, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Cool too. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.